The earrings were from Lisbon. Elena had bought them on a Tuesday morning 4 years ago in a shop so small the owner had to turn sideways to reach the display case. She'd been traveling alone, something she'd done exactly twice in her adult life, both times with the particular mixture of freedom and self-consciousness that comes from eating dinner without someone to talk to. The earrings were hand-shaped, a deep amber set in oxidized silver, and she'd stood in that narrow shop for longer than was probably reasonable, holding them in her palm, deciding. She bought them. She wore them home on the plane. They had been, in the private accounting she kept of things that were simply hers, one of the better decisions she'd made. She was wearing them at Sunday lunch when Gracie's hand came across the table. The lunch was at Richard and Diane's house, the way it always was. Richard had inherited their parents' instinct for gathering, the long table, the too much food, the sense that love was best expressed through logistics. Elena had been coming to these Sundays for 9 years, since Richard married Diane, long enough that she knew which chair wobbled and which burner on the stove ran hot, and exactly how Diane's mother would redirect any conversation that made her uncomfortable. She knew the room. She thought she knew the temperature of it. Gracie was 9 and had recently developed a habit of announcing things. Not lying exactly, more like reporting, with great confidence, information she had received from her parents and now considered established fact. She moved through the world this way, Gracie, with the assurance of someone who has never had to doubt their sources. She reached across Elena's plate without preface, the way children reach, no announcement, no permission, just the assumption of access, and took hold of the left earring. "Mom says these are cheap knockoffs," she said, conversational. Almost kind, in the way that delivery of received wisdom can sound kind, because the person saying it has no idea it might land as anything else. The table responded before Elena did, her brother's short laugh. Diane's longer one, which contained something that had been waiting, Elena now thought, for exactly this kind of sanctioned release. The cousin. Diane's mother. Not everyone, but enough to constitute a room agreeing on something. Elena felt the earring pull, and then felt the small resistance of silver that has been handled carefully for 4 years, and then isn't, and then heard the sound. A thin snap, barely audible under the laughter. Gracie held the broken piece up like a finding. Elena reached across and took it from her, took both pieces, the one still in her ear and the one in Gracie's hand, and set them on the white tablecloth beside her water glass. She did not look at Diane. She asked someone to pass the bread. Someone did. She ate the rest of her lunch with the steadiness of a person determined not to give a room the shape of their hurt, which is its own kind of exhausting. But she had learned this particular skill over years of practice, and she was good at it. She said goodbye at the door with the right pressure in the hug and the right words, and she drove herself home. The weight of the afternoon didn't arrive until the highway, which is where things tend to arrive when you've been holding them carefully through other people's company. She replayed the laughter in the specific way you replay things when you're looking for the moment it turned. Not the earring, but what was underneath the earring. Mom says they're cheap knockoffs, which meant Diane had looked at Elena's earrings at some point, in some other conversation, and formed an opinion and shared it with her daughter. Which meant the opinion had been available, sitting in the household, waiting for a table and an audience. Elena thought about the private school payment. She thought about it the way you think about something you've been paying for so long it's become invisible, like a subscription you set up once and forgot. 3 years ago, Richard had mentioned, careful and slightly embarrassed, that they were stretched thin and worried about Gracie's enrollment. Elena had offered before she'd finished thinking it through. $900 a month, transferred quietly because Gracie was her niece and Richard was her brother, and she had the means and the inclination, and she had believed without examining it too closely that this was what family did. She had never been thanked. Not properly, not in the way that acknowledges the size of a thing. She'd received the occasional offhand mention, "That's so helpful, the way you thank someone for holding a door." She drove and thought about what the room had looked like when Gracie held up the broken earring. Richard's face, which she was still parsing. Diane's laugh, which she had now assigned a more accurate description to than the one she'd been using for 9 years. She thought about what it meant to have been generous inside a contemptuous relationship. She hadn't known that was the relationship. That was the part that sat strangest. The earring pieces were on her kitchen counter when she got home. She'd put them there without thinking, emptied from her coat pocket, and then she'd looked at them and left them. She made tea. She didn't finish. She sat in her kitchen and did the thing she almost never let herself do, which was to think about what she actually wanted rather than what was fair or reasonable or measured. What she wanted was for Diane to have understood in that moment what she'd done. What she wanted was for Richard to have said something. What she wanted was to go back to the small shop in Lisbon and be the woman standing alone holding earrings in her palm. Before they meant this. None of those were available. What was available was the payment, which was voluntary, which had always been voluntary, which was something she had to keep returning to over the next hour as she sat in the kitchen. Because she knew herself, knew the way her mind would dress practical decisions in moral language and then interrogate the morality until she was paralyzed. She had to keep asking, whose money is this? And the answer was always hers, and the payment had always been a choice, and choices could be revisited. Is this punishment? She asked herself honestly. Maybe, she answered. Also, maybe it's just accurate. She went to bed. She slept less than she wanted to. In the morning, she called the school's billing office, not the school, accounts specifically. She explained that she would be discontinuing her third-party contribution at the end of the current billing cycle. The woman on the phone had a calm, administrative voice and asked if there was anything to note for the file. Elena said no. The call was 6 minutes. She showered, dressed, went to work. She thought about it less than she'd expected to, or not less, but differently. The thinking had a different quality now. Like a door she'd been standing in front of had opened, and she'd walked through and could now see the room she'd been blocking herself from. She didn't know yet what was in the room, but she was through the door. Richard called on a Wednesday afternoon, which meant the billing notice had arrived. She knew it would. The account was in his name. The school's finance office would flag any change to payment arrangements. That was simply how institutions worked. He was using his careful voice. She'd grown up with that voice. She knew its architecture. He explained that they'd received a notice from the school. He asked if there had been some problem with the payment, as though the most plausible explanation was error rather than intention. She told him she'd decided to redirect the money. He waited. She recognized the wait. It was an invitation for her to fill silence with explanation, which she had always done, reliably, because silence in this family had always been her discomfort to manage. She let it sit. He asked why. She thought about what to say. She thought about the table, the laughter, the sound of the earring, his face. She thought about 9 years of Sundays. She thought about Lisbon and the shop, and the woman she'd been on that trip, alone and slightly self-conscious and more herself than she usually managed. "I think it's better this way," she said. He asked what that meant. She said she thought he probably understood. The call ended without resolution, which was the honest shape of it. She sat with her phone after and felt something that was not satisfaction but was close to solidity. A sense of ground underfoot that hadn't been there before. Diane's text came Thursday morning. It was long and carefully constructed, which told Elena it had been revised. The lunch was described as light-hearted. Gracie was noted to be a child who doesn't always understand context. There was a suggestion, gently worded, that Elena might be bringing a sensitivity to the situation that was perhaps disproportionate. The earring was referred to as "What Happened with the Jewelry." Elena read it once, all the way through, giving it the fair reading she tried to give most things. Then she put her phone face down and made coffee. She didn't reply. Not as strategy. She'd spent enough of her life engineering responses for maximum diplomatic effect, and she was tired of the engineering. She genuinely did not know what honest reply existed, and she was no longer willing to send something dishonest for the sake of smoothing a surface that kept requiring smoothing. The earring pieces were still on her counter. She looked at while the coffee brewed. Amber sat in oxidized silver, one whole, one in 2 pieces. She thought about the shop in Lisbon, the owner turning sideways, the narrow space, the decision she'd stood with longer than was reasonable. She thought about wearing them home on the plane and feeling obscurely like herself. She didn't know what to do with them. She wasn't ready to throw them away, and she wasn't ready to have them fixed, and she wasn't ready to move them from the counter, so she left them. They stayed there through the week like something she was still deciding about. The birthday gathering was 3 weeks later. Not a Sunday lunch, a neutral occasion, different house, a cousin's daughter turning 7, the kind of event where the family distributed itself more loosely and the seating wasn't assigned, and you could find pockets of conversation that didn't require you to perform in any particular direction. Elena went. She wasn't sure, the morning of, whether she would. She went. She sat at a table with these people and ate cake that was very sweet, and talked about the things that were safe to talk about, and watched Gracie run across the backyard with the birthday girl, unself-conscious and fast, a child who had already forgotten the Sunday entirely, which was its own kind of information. She watched Richard across the room. He looked at her once, and then away, and then back again with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between apology and stubbornness, which she recognized because she had seen it on his face at 12, and at 19, and at 34, and apparently now at 41. He was her brother. She knew the shape of him. She also knew, newly, the shape of his silences. Diane did not look at her directly for most of the afternoon. Elena stayed 2 hours. She said goodbye to the right people with the right pressure in the hugs. She drove home in the early evening, the light going amber and flat, the way it does in late autumn when the sun drops fast. She thought about what had changed and what hadn't. Richard was still her brother. Gracie was still her niece, still running across yards without looking back, still 9 years old in the way that 9 years old is temporary and irreversible. The family was still the family, its habits, its temperatures, its particular way of filling rooms. But something in Elena had finished a calibration it had been working on for a long time. Not closed, that wasn't the right word. More like, she now had an accurate reading of the instrument and could account for its tendencies and would no longer be surprised by its errors. The earrings were still on her kitchen counter when she got home. She looked at them for a moment. Then she picked up the broken one. Both pieces, fitting them together in her palm the way you fit something to see if it can still make its original shape, and set it back down. Not tonight. She'd decide later. There was no hurry now. She knew what the earrings were and where they were from and what morning she'd been standing in when she chose them. Gracie's hand couldn't change that. Diane's laugh couldn't reach it. Some things stay yours not because nobody tries to take them, but because they were never the kind of thing that could be taken. You just have to know the difference. She was learning to know the difference. It was not a comfortable knowledge, but it was hers, and it was growing, and she was beginning to think that might be enough.